Hell is the place where the person you are meets the person you could have been. There are a few places where I could create launchpads from this video, including how it started from the very beginning, but since After School did end like this, I will engage from here. It is dangerous to create a precedent in people's minds that says that perpetual jealousy is an end goal. That is, to validate one's envy in such a way as to trap them in their curiosity. All it does is turn people around into the idea of nihilism, which we already have to grow out of and develop defenses against in pursuit of our highest selves. That is, if that is your pursuit. And that is part of the point of being a teacher or having any semblance of hope or faith for the future, for life, and one's physical survival. It is apparent that regardless of one's cultural or economic background, we all maintain a perpetual state of awareness of our mortality. We can fathom the idea of no longer existing, of no longer having the ability to contribute to the world around us, to not make any more memories or be a part of them, to fill the air with our idiosyncrasies that we turn into recalls. With all the access that we have been granted to one another, and the simple fact that we are bound to integrate and interact with one another, it is becoming more and more clear how each of our perceived distances from our mortality also determine our perceived distances from each other. This plays out in a multitude of ways. And at the end of the day, what is most significant is that there is an everlasting truth that exists in the midst of all of our opinions and interpretations of the things that happen to us in our presence and within our scope of awareness. We call that truth reality. After School started the video with a great common phrase that is said to people in general. He'll do great things. Usually, during our adulthood, we are protected from the so-called harshness of the world. We are endlessly forgiven and we have a consciousness of this. We see these areas where mom gets upset and how she deals with it, where dad shows his restraint, where he should have used the force we know is in him. And if nothing else, there is the perception of the outside world, who champions the child as to not give them the perception that, in reality, we could care less about what anyone else is doing as long as it doesn't pertain to something that could be relevant to them. There are numerous ways to speak of this relevance, but the objective is not to trivialize everything. Your ears allow you to hear, and you have heard. And we do know that the larger picture I am alluding to is the environment that the person has to grow up in that shows them that people are capable of different things, projecting different things. The world does not revolve around us, and there is much to see of the world. This encouragement is enough to propel many a person, though. And as After School illustrates, the precedent that you will be something is enough to sustain many a people. How many of us do have support systems that still uphold that level of encouragement to give us that benefit of the doubt? Because without them, what is there truly? You can go ahead and say that you don't have them. And how much would that really be true in their reality or yours? But is the objective to compare the capacities of our oppression? Or is it to address the larger picture, which is that we have to come to grow into this environment that shows us that there are many different kinds of people who exist in the world, and thus we must prepare ourselves as best as we can, if we plan to be people of the world, to meet various kinds of characters. This is the critical piece of starting the conversation surrounding endless fantasy, because there are plenty of people who do not wish to be people of the world or don't have support systems or people to rely on to any real useful degree. There are also, of course, those who have been discouraged and see what it is like to genuinely feel discouraged. And surely, if as After School has alluded to in his closing statement, perceiving a better version of yourself is enough to feel discouraged, then surely it is the courage that we need help with. This is all so important to note because for what does a man continue to live if he isn't being uplifted and encouraged to be his best self? He is still here. So alas, there is a caliber of men, of people, whose lasting belief in the continuance of being a part of a world that doesn't encourage them or where they are not encouraged is that they are still here anyway. Suicide is much too difficult, even dramatic many times, especially when you have the wisdom to know that there are many different people in the world and thus many different opportunities to make impressions. We all know there is so much time here, but we are not all made to feel how that time presses upon us to the same capacities to cause us to finally kick in that level of seriousness and gratitude for life that makes us be efficient with our time and expenditure. This is why we play a critical role as parents, families, and overall citizens to establish precedents of efficiency, responsibility, productivity, and faith and trust to reinforce our young boys and girls so that they find themselves as equipped as possible as the time goes on to make meaningful judgments on relevant things to effectively use time. At 40 seconds, I have to allow the author to breathe on his notion about women waving to the young man casually. It is mostly a setting of a fantasy of his own, where there was a time when the ultimate thing to take interest in was our surroundings. I guess he hadn't the time to speak of the dynamics between the sexes even before a time when our technology became a crutch unto us, establishing itself as a precedent in our lives. There are plenty of people who exist who still remember what life was like before we all had reliable internet connection and devices to interface with it. But nonetheless, this is After Skool's fantasy about the fantasy, and there is more to comment on beyond this. There is an overwhelming amount of delusion in the way of figuring out how to tell the story of the fall of man in his own society, because there is an overwhelming amount of deflection in the way of telling the story of how a man gets to where he got. Now, of course, if the truth is too much to bear that you have not always served as the best example to be, or that you don't have the perspective to see multiple ways through, I understand how these offenses could be made. However, if we truly intend to be helpful and provide a sense of relevance and meaning to people, then we must be transparent about how we wind up in the places we go. Because although, yes, we can wind up in the same areas like repentance and having faith and the desire to understand one another, there are many different circumstances that place us in different predicaments, but that can meet still for other people to find their way out, and thus we must be transparent. The author uses a spirit called the spirit of seeing to illustrate the point of projection serving as a sort of spoiler to the wonders of life, including seeing that which one could not currently see, which is the physical manifestation of one's perception of themselves in their full glory. Though I think it is crucial to note that the embodiment of one's highest self is not necessarily always encompassing. We may know or consider that the thing is all-encompassing as the thing projected in something we wish to master, but we usually idealize our projected self in the segments in which we see ourselves improving. That is, for example, being tolerant of others not to lose one's temper simply because of the presence of deviants or detractors otherwise. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, there is the most egregious offense of the entire video, which is the oblivion play. After Skool here failed to acknowledge that many people, especially those who once admired us, has a spirit of seeing or access to this means of seeing the world in projections, including those engineered to our fantasies, which has contributed to each of our perceptions of one another. I am compelled to mention that perhaps many of us do not seek to reach some higher version of ourselves. Instead, it may be enough to be liked or validated by others, to feel like they fit in, that they live in a community which accepts them. It is sufficient for many to be a slut or deviant for the sake of confirmation of their existence. Because of the fact that the author failed to mention that everyone has access to a spirit of seeing of sorts, it has impacted our society as a whole. Because the author did not make this point, the story serves as a pinning of blame on the part of man's excellence for the deterioration of social conditions in our society. And though it is a part of the truth, it is nowhere close to the whole truth. It is dangerous that we continue as a society to paint this image, that is to say that women have been fulfilling their end of the bargain throughout the development of our condition. Is it enough for me to say that the exchange has never always been that man aspires toward excellence and is allowed to go along his way peacefully to pursue his muse? Must I mention the fluidity of characters that we meet of various backgrounds who gnaw at him for his time and attention, whether for sexual gratification or some other personal gratification that is not always necessarily positive or useful? Should I mention how much society has intended to drain the aspirational man, to test his limits so that they can see his mortality for themselves? Thus, I am compelled to ask, has it ever been enough for us to simply know that we can die or experience pain to be empathic and understanding toward one another for the capacity of pain? I would say that it is our capacity to empathize for suffering that allows us to relate to others and creates the precedents by which we interface with the world. For example, a trained martial artist is exposed to various ways that he can harm people and thus prefers peaceable resolutions as opposed to constantly looking to flex his abilities on any willing opponent. Military people of all kinds ultimately do not come home with the intent of being violent or chaotic as they may have needed to be during the time of their service. And yet, people at home and of various social and economic circumstances make threats and estimations out of emotion and feeling, out of a knowledge of what it implies, but with not quite a true understanding because they have not ever had to face the issue in their own lives. Now, am I saying that everyone should serve 2 years minimum in the military and get into fights and witness violence and death in the flesh? Perhaps. But also, perhaps the touching of the hot stove isn't enough for some children. Who are these children? See, there wouldn't be so much of this issue to speak of if it weren't for this persistent practice of deflection and irresponsibility, as was shown here in this video. After Skool completely shortchanged the entire message of their video by trying not to inflame women or manginas who live up on a cloud of imperviousness to accountability, which is another critical problem in our society that I speak of often. See, there wouldn't be so much of this issue to speak of if it weren't for this persistent practice of deflection and irresponsibility, as was shown here in this video. After Skool completely shortchanged the entire message of their video by trying not to inflame women or manginas who live up on a cloud of imperviousness to accountability, which is another critical problem in our society that I speak of often. This air of a desire to embrace and encourage victimhood. It is interesting where people have their postulations on where they believe people become obstacles to themselves and others and behave in forms of jealousy and envy as shadows of themselves. And as I said previously, our perceived distance from our mortality speaks to how we deal with our processing of these estimations. So much so that people would dare to disagree with me that their ability to articulate the depths comes from how far they have traversed in them. I'm not saying that everyone needs to have a near-death experience story to speak of to have a valid point in a conversation about problems and solutions, but I can say that if it is humanity that we are dealing with, then we should allow humans to articulate their problems because, after all, you could only study what has been brought to you, and then you have to make the choice to study. Life is so much more nuanced than our focuses, though the picture is still able to be grasped. It's a fine line, but we cannot really identify the boundaries unless we enumerate them honestly and transparently. Those with ears, let them hear.